Gaius Julius Caesar's probably one of the most well-known figures in world history. He's got a month named after him, foods are named after him, casinos are named after him, and his name is the basis for titles like Kaiser, Tsar, and of course, Caesar. But what about his depiction in Fate Grand Order? Normally I try to be a bit mysterious about this, keep up the suspense, but, well, Caesar in FGO sucks. Sure, in gameplay terms he's actually pretty good, but as a character? No. So what's wrong with him? Well, let's go through his class, design, skill set, backstory, and characterization to find out what works and what doesn't, before ending by giving a grade for how well FGO's version compares to the original. A grade that I'm sure will surprise precisely no one. Anyway, let's get to it. Caesar is a Saber class servant, which, well, this is interesting, largely because Caesar himself takes issue with it literally from the very moment you summon him. Apparently it's not a good class choice for him, but what's wrong with it? Well, the real Caesar is best known for commanding armies, doing politics, and getting murderized. Caesar was known for being a battle commander willing to get close to the action, though not to the same extent as Alexander. He had a sword, of course, and he also rode a horse that apparently had a deformity that made it look like it had human toes. Freaky. It's been said that Caesar would be best as a rider, and that this is the reason why his Saber version is so screwy. But is that really right? Because something I've noticed with other commander servants is that their class tends to mirror what their armies were known for. Alexander's army used combined arms, but he personally led his companion cavalry, the hammer that smashed the enemy against the anvil of his infantry. Also, he had his horse, Bucephalus, so it makes sense for him to be a rider. Napoleon? He started out as an artillery officer, made heavy use of artillery, and sometimes even aimed the guns himself, both as a junior officer, but even still as Emperor of the French. So he gets archer. Oda Nobunaga? Guns. Lots of guns. Another archer. There are exceptions, of course, particularly if a servant is known for wielding a specific weapon. Altera, Attila, led the Huns in their famed horsemen, and yet she's a saber, since Attila wielded a sword he called the Sword of Mars. Anyway, my point is that Caesar, who was well known for leading Roman legionaries, heavy infantry wielding swords and javelins, it's not that weird for him to be a saber. Is he a master swordsman? No, but saber is a better fit for Caesar than it is for Nero, who was only a saber because she used imperial privilege to make it so. Getting into his character design, Caesar is certainly different from his usual depictions. Though with that said, his design does pull elements from common interpretations. He wears the civic crown in all of his ascension forms, that wreath thing he wears on his head. That is a decoration awarded for military service, specifically for saving the life of a fellow Roman. Caesar won this early in his career and wore it often, not just to show off, but also to hide the fact that he was going bald from an early age. And while him wearing a suit in his first ascension is obviously anachronistic, at least it's red, the traditional color of the Roman soldier. He gets a chestplate for his second ascension which, well, it's not what legionaries would wear, but it's not completely terrible. As for his third ascension, his left arm turns to stone, likely a reference to either just how much this guy features in statues, or perhaps a link to his divinity. Now, Caesar wasn't a god, but his family claimed ancestry all the way back to Aeneas, a son of Venus, Rome's equivalent of Aphrodite. Also, Caesar was deified after his death, which is why he gets D-rank divinity as a passive skill. Now, there is one other thing I could talk about regarding Caesar's FGO design. Something rather large. A big change from his usual depiction. Something that often gets heavy criticism. And while I could tear into that rather gigantic difference, I'm not going to. Why? Because I don't need to. Caesar's design is mediocre at best, though at least you can tell that he's supposed to be a Roman. But I don't need to talk about Caesar's thick build to damn him. There's plenty of other things for me to complain about. Moving into a skill set, Caesar's first skill is Tactics, a generic skill meant to represent one's skill in leading troops into combat. On the surface, I don't have a problem with Caesar having this skill, generic though it may be. No, what my problem is that it's only rank B. We are talking about one of history's most famous generals. In my earlier video on Bedivere, I pointed out that Caesar having this at rank B was another reason to roast him. But then a comment pointed out that there isn't a single servant in Fate who has a tactics skill higher than B. Not even Iskandar, Alexander the Great, who, I remind you, never lost a battle in his life. So rather than roasting Caesar specifically for having this skill at too low a rank, instead I should roast the designers for apparently deciding that nobody, not even Alexander, Caesar, or Napoleon, is worthy of A-rank tactics. This is stupid. Caesar's second skill is charisma, another generic skill representing a person's charm or leadership abilities. Like what I said about tactics, I don't have an issue with Caesar having charisma, but rather that it's rank C? Are you kidding me? We are talking about one of the most legendary leaders in Western civilization, who was massively popular with the people, inspired fanatical loyalty in his soldiers, and is one of history's most effective wielders of propaganda. In 47 BCE, Caesar went to talk to some of his troops who were staging a mutiny, upset at how long it was taking for Caesar's promises to them to be fulfilled. Caesar made a speech that not only quelled the mutiny, but had those rebelling soldiers beg Caesar to take them to his next campaign in Africa. This should be A-rank charisma, at minimum. Anything less than that is absurd. Lastly, Caesar's third skill is insight, a Caesar unique skill about his skill at oratory, persuasion, and convincing the people to support him. Okay, now this is much better for the reasons I just mentioned. But then, why have the charisma skill at all? This is pretty similar to that. And it's not like Caesar doesn't have an abundance of things you could make skills out of. I'll do it right now. First across the Rhine, Britain's first invader, the double walls of Alesia, alia jacta est, vidi veni vici, etc., etc. But speaking of that last one,
Watashi wa kita. Watashi wa mita. Naraba tsugi wa katsu dake no koto.
Julius Caesar's noble phantasm is crocha mors, whereupon he charges up his sword, paraphrases one of his famous quotes, and proceeds to slice up his foe. Crocha mors, or Yellow Death in Latin, is Caesar's sword in the legend that is generally considered to be fictional. Apparently, during one of his expeditions to Britain, Caesar fought some guy named Nennius in single combat, but his sword got stuck in Nennius's shield. Nennius then took Caesar's sword for himself, and proceeded to kill or maim everyone he attacked with a single blow. Caesar only barely escaped with his life. This story appears in Geoffrey of Monmouth's 12th century book, History of the Kings of Britain, the same book that is a major source for Arthurian legend. So, I mean, technically this can work as a Caesar MP. It's a sword, he's a saber, so I guess? But of all the things that could have been Caesar's MP, they chose some obscure story most people consider to be fiction as opposed to, I don't know, literally anything the man actually did in real life. I'm getting the distinct impression that the devs really didn't want to make Caesar powerful at all, despite that his standing in the historical record demands that he ought to be. Caesar's craft essence is Legend of the Gallic War, which I'm assuming it's supposed to be the Commentari di Bello Gallico, the commentaries on the Gallic War. The CE's text certainly suggests that it is, in which case this is actually a great CE choice. The text contains some characterization for Caesar, with him saying that while his experiences in Gaul helped him grow as a person, he doesn't seem too eager to talk about it. Yet despite that, when compared to the politics of Rome, his time in Gaul probably was better. He says this during his interlude too, but I don't entirely buy this. For one, he doesn't seem eager to talk about his time in Gaul. He literally wrote a book about it, the book that this craft essence is depicting. And second, Caesar's campaign in Gaul was ultimately about his political ambitions rather than military conquest. If it was just about the war, I suspect Caesar would have gone about things very differently, including perhaps never writing the book that this craft essence features. It was, after all, a work meant to promote his accomplishments, boost his popularity with the Roman public, and so advance his political career. It's a good CE choice, but the text makes me raise an eyebrow. Caesar's Valentine CE is cena, Caesar style, depicting a huge array of food. A cena was the main meal of the day in Roman society, the one time of the day when the family and guests would gather to eat, chat, and have a good time. Just how much food there was available depended upon a family's wealth. For most people, a cena would be something like a normal meal, while for the rich it could be a huge elaborate banquet. Caesar, of course, was the latter, more so in his later life, and so the feast depicted in the CE fits. As for the text, it makes another reference to the size issue I danced around when talking about his design. Apparently, he's trying to do better. But getting into that for real now? Apparently it refers to the massive feast that came with the 4 triumphs held in 46 BCE at the end of the Great Civil War, celebrating Caesar's victories in Gaul, Egypt, Pontus, and Africa, victories carefully selected to be ones against non-Romans. Apparently he ate a lot during this celebration, and so that's why he's like this in Fate. But this is creative license running wild. Caesar was a very physically active man up until his death. Indeed, he was killed only 3 days before he was set to leave for another military campaign against Parthia, and he was also closing in on his 55th birthday. A guy at that age, in that time period, with FGO Caesar's build would be lucky to still be alive, never mind be about to go off to war again. Now for characterization, starting with a look into the legends surrounding Gaius Julius Caesar. And here we go, my second video on a historical giant after Charlemagne. At first, I thought I'd make 2 videos, a history video and this FGO comparison video. But after writing over 2,700 words before I even got to the Gallic Wars, which is about twice as many words as I try to keep the backstory sections at, it's too much. So instead I'm going to do what I did with Charlemagne, give some quick facts about Caesar so that we don't have to be here for an entire hour. But for the interesting anecdotes from Caesar's life, while making a Titanic super video may be too much, making a few YouTube shorts is much more feasible, and so that's what I plan to do. The first ones should already be up by now, so go check them out if you haven't already. Anyway, on to Caesar. Gaius Julius Caesar is pretty much the most famous Roman to ever live. As a military commander, his record was impressive. Where did he fight? His first service was in Asia at the Siege of Mytilene in 81 BCE, when Caesar was 19. This is where he won the civic crown, the wreath thing. After this, he got into politics for a while, became governor of the province of Hispania Ulterior from 61 to 60 BCE, where he captured more of the Iberian Peninsula for Rome. After his term as consul in 59 BCE, Caesar began the Gallic Wars, where over the coming years he would fight a ton of battles against various opponents, defeating the Helvetii at Bibracte in 58 BCE, then defeated the Suebi under Ariovistus in the Battle of the Vosges later that year, won a tough battle against the Nervae and their allies at the Battle of the Sabis in 57 BCE, won a naval battle against the Veneti in the Battle of Morbihan in 56 BCE, crossed the Rhine in 55 BCE, the first Roman to ever do so, landed twice in Britain in 55 and 54 BCE, another first for Rome, crushed Ambiorix's revolt in 54 and 53 BCE, before finally facing off against Vercingetorix and his alliance of Gallic tribes in 52 BCE. Caesar was defeated by Vercingetorix at Gergovia, but then won a stunning victory at Alesia later that year, a battle made famous by the extensive engineering works that Caesar's legions built. With the defeat of Vercingetorix, though some resistance continued, the whole of Gaul had been conquered by Caesar. The Gallic Wars made Caesar incredibly famous and incredibly rich, but it was also a very ugly affair. Exact numbers are impossible to verify, and the numbers Caesar gives in his commentaries are unreliable, but Caesar claimed to have killed as many as 1 million Gauls, with another 1 million being sold into slavery. You could probably cut those numbers in half, but that's still insane for the time period. Of course, after Caesar's victories, his opponents in Rome, the Optimates or the Pompeians, threw down an ultimatum for him to disband his armies, resign from his offices, or else be declared an enemy of Rome. Since doing that would likely have led to his exile or death, Caesar instead crossed the Rubicon in January 49 BCE, igniting the Great Roman Civil War, or Caesar's Civil War. This took Pompey and the Optimates by surprise, and they were quickly forced to evacuate Rome. Now time to dash through another succession of battles. Caesar captured Corfinium in February 49 BCE, then captured Brundisium in March 49 BCE as Pompey retreated to Greece. Marching west to Hispania, Caesar won the Battle of the Erda in the summer of 49 BCE, before returning to Rome to prepare for the coming campaign in Greece. Heading to Greece in January 48 BCE, Caesar was defeated by Pompey at Heraclium in July 48 BCE, but then won the decisive victory at Pharsalus a month later, shattering Pompey's army. Pompey fled to Egypt, only to get murderized by the Ptolemies, which really upset Caesar, and motivated him to intervene in Egypt's succession crisis between Ptolemy XIII and his sister and wife, Cleopatra VII. Caesar was put under siege in Alexandria from late 48 to the middle of 47 BCE, but then broke the siege and won the Battle of the Nile, where Ptolemy XIII was killed, securing Egypt's throne for Cleopatra. Caesar then rushed north to deal with an attack by Pharnacles II of Pontus, crushing him in the Battle of Zela in August 47 BCE. This campaign, finished in only a few days, is what Caesar was referring to in his famous quote, Veni Vidi Vici, I came, I saw, I conquered. After this, Caesar first went back to Rome, and then to go finish off what was left of the Pompeian faction. Going by ship from Sicily to Africa at the end of 47 BCE, Caesar lost the Battle of Ruspina in January 46, but then utterly crushed the Optimates at Thapsus in April 46 BCE. He returned to Rome again, celebrated 4 triumphs, then went to Hispania, defeating the sons of Pompey at the Battle of Munda in March 45 BCE. Returning to Rome in October of that year, Caesar was preparing to launch a new campaign against the Parthians in the east in the year 44 BCE, but he got murderized 3 days before he was set to leave. Quick reminder that armies in these days, they marched on foot, or got onto ships powered by oars. And while the Romans did build extensive road networks to speed these movements up, that's still a lot of marching. Caesar's assassination might very well be the most famous assassination in European history. While meeting the Senate at the Theater of Pompey in Rome, a few dozen senators stabbed Caesar no less than 23 times. As for who these assassins were, some of them had served Caesar, but now turned against him. Many, including the ringleaders Brutus and Cassius, had been against Caesar during the Civil War, but had been pardoned by him. Their motivations were many: hatred, jealousy, a desire to save the Republic, opposition to tyranny, etc. With so many different desires at play, the assassins could only agree to kill Caesar, and had no plan for what to do after that. This turned out to be a fatal mistake. Caesar's consul Mark Antony, his magister equitum Lepidus, and Octavian, who Caesar adopted as his son and heir in his will, would all join forces. And these 3 men, forming the Second Triumvirate, took one critical lesson from Caesar: that Caesar, ironically for a man accused of being a tyrant, had been too nice, too merciful, too forgiving of his enemies. Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus would not make the same mistake. Thousands would be killed in the coming years, including all of Caesar's assassins. The 3 then turned on each other, ultimately resulting in Octavian's victory. Caesar's assassins killed him hoping to save the Republic. Instead, they sealed its fate, and the victorious Octavian would become Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. So, some quick facts about Caesar. Contrary to popular belief, he was not actually born via caesarean section. Rather, he made a law that, if the mother's life was forfeit, then that method would be used to save the child. The Saladin Casino named after Caesar have nothing to do with him. That probably isn't a surprise. But one thing that absolutely does is the calendar. Caesar reformed the Roman calendar in 46 BCE, changing it from the 10-month lunisolar calendar that alternated between 355, 377, 355, and 378 days each year over 4 years, to instead go to a 12-month solar calendar with 365 days, with an extra day added every 4 years, giving us the Julian calendar. A few months after his assassination in 44 BCE, the Senate took the month that Caesar was born in and renamed it in his honor, the name changing from Quintilis to Julius, July. The Julian calendar would remain in force until the introduction of the Gregorian calendar in 1582, though the Julian calendar continued to see use well into the 20th century, and is still used by the Eastern Orthodox Church. Like with Charlemagne, you could keep talking about Caesar's impact upon history for a long time, because it's simply gigantic. He is one of the best military commanders of all time, a politician famed for his oratory and charisma, and a man whose complicated legacy continues to fascinate and inspire even 2,000 years later. And because of just how big a deal Caesar is in world history, that makes his relatively meager presence in Fate Grand Order all the more jarring. We first meet Caesar in the Septem Singularity, where he is one of the emperors of the United Empire. Aside from making a few references to his life and uttering a few quotes, this Caesar seems like little more than a bored womanizer, annoyed about how he has to fight on the front lines himself. He's not the worst portrayed character in Septem, but that's like saying his stool isn't as smelly. At the end of the day, it's still shit. As for his interlude, he says that stuff he talks about in his craft essence, about how his time at war was an escape for him, away from the messy politics back in Rome. The rest of the interlude is about beating up a remnant of himself left behind from Septem, then absorbing its power back to get a boost. Septem is Caesar's only major story appearance thus far, but he does appear in quite a variety of events and other servant interludes. Christmas events, Halloween events, Gawain's interlude, Van Gogh's interlude, etc. In all of these instances, Caesar is depicted as a shady businessman, a used car salesman type who is always trying to make money at the expense of others. He does seem to have at least some scruples, at least compared to Columbus. But was the real Caesar like that? So far in this video, like his actual assassination in real life, I've gotten quite a few stabs in so far, but none of them have been fatal. Well, now it's time for Brutus. Now it's time for the fatal blow. Because while Caesar did make tons of money in ways people today would find seriously questionable, waging war, seizing property, and selling people into slavery, Caesar wasn't known for being greedy. On the contrary, Caesar was famed for his mercy and generosity, to the point that it probably got him killed, since many of the people he showed mercy to later helped assassinate him. One example of this lies in Caesar's will, where he gave away a substantial amount of his wealth to every citizen in Rome, perhaps 250,000 people. Each citizen got 75 denarii, or 300 sestertii, the equivalent of a few months of pay for the average citizen. Now, you could argue that Caesar's generosity was calculated to gain political advantage, and that showing mercy to his enemies could even be seen as cruel, to have them accept his pardon and so his superiority over them. It was that feeling of humiliation that motivated many of Caesar's assassins. But my point is, Caesar was a calculating man who wielded his generosity and mercy for his own gain. But crucially, Caesar wanted people to love him, and being an untrustworthy shady debt collector in Chaldea is contrary to that goal. There's also the fact that, before he got that wealth, Caesar himself was deeply indebted to creditors. It was actually one of his major motivations for going to war in the first place, to get loot from enemies of Rome to help pay off his own debts. There is one positive thing I have to say about Caesar's depiction though, his relationship with Cleopatra. It's actually rather wholesome, showing that Caesar seems to genuinely love Cleopatra, and he says that he regrets not marrying her and making their son his official heir. In life, Caesar's relationship with Cleopatra was not very popular in Rome, especially since he was cheating on his Roman wife, Calpurnia. The fact that it was a foreign queen certainly didn't help, furthering suspicions that Caesar was looking to make himself a king. For a man who was always looking for political advantage, Caesar's relationship with Cleopatra hurt him more than it helped. So why did Caesar get together with her? The logical conclusion is that he really did love her, and that this is something FGO depicts quite nicely. As for what Cleopatra thought of their relationship, well, we will get back to that another time. And now for the verdict. What grade would I give Caesar's depiction in Fate Grand Order? Well, I could do what I usually do. Summarize my findings, express some final thoughts, before finally wrapping it up and giving the grade. But there's no suspense here. Caesar's depiction in FGO is awful, with very few redeeming qualities. That this is how the developers chose to depict one of the biggest names in Roman, European, and world history is just why? Caesar is a name on par with Alexander, and while I've yet to dive into Alex properly, Iskandar certainly made a strong impression in Fate Zero. Even if I find things wrong with his accuracy, Iskandar is awesome. You may not agree with him, but he's a great character. Caesar, on the other hand, is a joke. A really unfunny joke when he should be one of the most charismatic, ambitious, and powerful servants in all of Fate. They do give the argument that a writer Caesar would be more like the real Caesar, but JP celebrated its 9th anniversary a few months ago, and we still don't have writer Caesar. The more I dig into the servants of Fate and how they compare to their originals, the more I start to form some conclusions. And based on what I've analyzed in Boudica and Caesar, and what I've seen of Nero, Romulus, and Spartacus, I'm getting the impression that the Fate writers either don't know how to do Rome, or don't understand its significance in the Western world. If they did, then I don't think they would have screwed up Caesar this badly. He's not the depiction I find the most offensive. Boudica still takes that award, but Caesar is certainly among the worst depicted servants in the entire franchise. And so for a final grade, I'm going to give Gaius Julius Caesar, conqueror of Gaul and dictator perpetuo, an F. Now, normally when I fail a servant, I proceed to set them on fire and do a psychotic laugh. But Caesar is so famous and his depiction is so bad despite that fame that I'm going to do something special. Rather than setting Caesar on fire, instead, I'm going to have him watch something. A reenactment of a moment in his life that I'm sure the servant Caesar remembers quite well. So, two things. First, when are we getting Brutus as an assassin servant? And second, now I kinda hope we don't get Caesar as a writer, because I don't think he will ever forgive me for this. Anyway, if you would like to learn more about another character in Rome's history that got completely shafted in fate, check out my video on Boudica here. Until next time,